Could a single American general command so much respect from his enemies that thousands of German soldiers would risk execution by their own side just to find him? As the Third Reich collapsed in May 1945, George S. Patton became more than a conqueror. He became a sanctuary for a defeated Wehrmacht, desperate for an honorable end. This is the untold story of why the most feared man in Europe was the only one the Germans would trust. The morning of May 7, 1945, at the Third Army headquarters in Regensburg, Germany, did not begin with the quiet dignity of a looming peace, but rather with a frantic energy that pulsated through the corridors of power as the machinery of the German war effort ground to a final bloody halt. General Hobart Gay, the steadfast chief of staff to the legendary George S. Patton, sat hunched over maps that were being redrawn by the hour, his eyes tracing the rapid dissolution of the Nazi front lines, while reports of chaos flooded in from every sector. The air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the rhythmic clatter of typewriters, but the atmosphere shattered when a young captain from the 11th Armored Division burst through the doors, his uniform caked in the dust of the Bavarian roads, and his breath hitching in his chest as he clutched a series of urgent dispatches. He bypassed the usual bureaucratic niceties, his voice trembling not with fear of the enemy, but with the sheer absurdity of the situation he had just witnessed on the front lines, where the rules of engagement were being rewritten by the Germans themselves. General Gay looked up, his brow furrowed with the exhaustion of coordinating a multi-front pursuit, and demanded to know what kind of situation could possibly warrant such a frantic intrusion during the final hours of the European conflict. The captain blurted out that a full German battalion, 800 men strong and bristling with high-end equipment, had approached their lines not to fight, but to surrender. Yet they were flatly refusing to lay down their arms to the soldiers currently holding the position. It was a tactical paradox that made no military sense, as the Germans were essentially holding themselves hostage within the sights of American tanks, insisting that they would only submit to General Patton personally, demanding a face-to-face meeting with the man they called Bloody Patton before they would relinquish a single Mauser or Luger. Gay stared in disbelief, his mind racing through the implications of 800 armed enemy soldiers, sitting on his doorstep like a stubborn congregation. But the captain's next words turned the confusion into a full-blown crisis of protocol. This wasn't an isolated incident of eccentric German pride, as the captain revealed that 3 other distinct units had attempted the exact same maneuver within the last 12 hours, including a company in the morning and a full regiment by mid-afternoon. These German soldiers were performing a surreal pilgrimage across the scorched landscape of Central Europe, purposefully bypassing British positions and even walking right past other American divisions, ignoring the outstretched hands of GIs who were more than willing to take them into custody. They were asking every patrol they encountered for the specific coordinates of the Third Army, driven by a singular, obsessive goal to reach the one commander they believed operated on a frequency they understood, a man who mirrored their own Prussian ideals of discipline and martial honor. The situation was escalating into a logistical nightmare, with thousands of heavily armed men wandering the countryside like a ghost army, refusing to acknowledge the authority of any officer who didn't serve under the banner of the ivory pistol-wearing general. General Gay, realizing that this was a phenomenon that surpassed simple battlefield fatigue, picked up the phone to reach Patton, who was likely already contemplating his place in the history books as the dust settled on the Third Reich's coffin. When the connection was made, Gay laid out the bizarre reality that the enemy was no longer surrendering to the United States government or the Allied Expeditionary Force, but to George S. Patton, the individual, treating him more like a sovereign entity than a subordinate general. There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line, a rare moment where even the boisterous Patton seemed to be processing the gravity of such a strange tribute from the men he had spent years trying to annihilate. Finally, the silence broke with a characteristic rasp as Patton remarked with a mixture of ego and grim satisfaction that even the Germans had standards, a line that would echo through the decades as a testament to the unique psychological shadow he cast over the European theater. To truly grasp why these hardened veterans of the Eastern and Western fronts were willing to gamble their lives on a specific American general, one must look deep into the cause and consequence of Patton's terrifying reputation within the halls of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. For years, German intelligence had maintained their files on Patton that were thicker and more detailed than those of any other Allied commander, tracking his movements from the sands of North Africa to the hedgerows of Normandy with an almost obsessive level of professional anxiety. One internal report from 1944 explicitly labeled him as the most dangerous American commander, citing his aggressive, unpredictable nature and his uncanny ability to execute rapid maneuvers that traditional military doctrine considered impossible. The German rank and file feared him as der blutige Patton, a nickname born not from a reputation for cruelty toward captives, but from the devastating efficiency with which his armored columns tore through German defenses, leaving nothing but twisted steel and broken dreams in their wake. Yet beneath this layer of primal fear lay a deep, almost spiritual respect among the German career officers who saw in Patton a reflection of their own vanishing warrior caste, a man who seemed more at home in the era of Frederick the Great than in the bureaucratic world of modern warfare. They recognized that Patton fought like a Prussian, emphasizing the Führung, or leadership from the front, demanding a level of iron discipline that mirrored the highest traditions of the German Academy, and valuing the concept of Soldatenehre, or soldierly honor, above all else. To a German colonel who had seen his country's military heritage co-opted and corrupted by the Nazi Party, Patton represented a throwback to the age of Clausewitz, a man who treated war as a professional calling rather than a political crusade. This perceived kinship created a psychological bridge, leading many to believe that while a politician might see them as criminals to be punished, a fellow warrior like Patton would see them as professional peers who had simply run out of time and luck. The first major spark that ignited this trend occurred on May 5th near Linz, Austria, when a German company of 150 men emerged from the tree line, their white flag fluttering in the wind, but their weapons still slung defiantly over their shoulders as they approached an American patrol. When the American sergeant ordered them to drop their weapons, the German captain, a man who looked like he had aged 20 years in the last 5, stood his ground with a firm refusal that left the GIs stunned and confused. He explained in clipped, accented English that they had walked 15 kilometers through a gauntlet of British and American units, specifically to find the Third Army, because they would only surrender to Patton and no one else. The sergeant, frustrated by what he saw as a suicidal display of arrogance, threatened to open fire, but the German officer merely shook his head, insisting that if they couldn't find Patton, they would simply turn around and keep marching, preferring to die in a hopeless skirmish than give up their dignity to a random patrol. This standoff triggered a chain of radio calls that spiraled up through the ranks, eventually reaching Patton's ears as he surveyed the collapsing front, and his reaction was one of genuine amusement at the sheer audacity of the enemy's request. He realized that by accepting this personal surrender, he wasn't just collecting prisoners. He was validating a certain code of conduct that he himself held dear. So he sent back a message accepting their surrender on behalf of the United States while allowing them to maintain the illusion of a personal transaction. The German captain finally nodded, satisfied that his unit's fate was now linked to a name he respected, but he insisted that the records show they surrendered to the man, not just the flag, a subtle distinction that preserved the last shred of pride for men who had lost everything else. This incident acted as a catalyst, a signal that flashed through the informal communication networks of the retreating Wehrmacht, telling them that there was a worthy opponent waiting in the West who would treat them with the professional courtesy they craved. By May 6, the scale of these Patton-only surrenders shifted from small companies to entire regiments, as a massive force of 2,000 German soldiers organized themselves in Bavaria, standing in perfect, disciplined formation with their weapons stacked like a silent monument to their 5 years of combat. When an American major named Reynolds arrived to process them, he was met with the same stone-faced demand. They would wait in that field, under the hot sun, for as long as it took for General Patton to arrive or acknowledge them. They refused to hand over their sidearms to junior officers, arguing that a combat regiment of their stature deserved to surrender to a commander of equal historical weight, a request that bordered on the theatrical, but was delivered with deadly seriousness. Major Reynolds was left watching an entire army unit sit down in the dirt, refusing to move or eat, their discipline so absolute that it intimidated the very men who were supposed to be capturing them. Patton's response to this regiment was a masterpiece of psychological warfare and leadership, as he sent word that their colonel fought honorably and would be allowed to keep his sidearm until formal processing was complete, a gesture that was practically unheard of in the chaos of the war's end. When this message was relayed, the German colonel didn't just stand up. He turned toward the direction of Patton's headquarters 30 miles away and snapped a crisp, precise salute into the empty air, an act of fealty to a man he had never met but deeply understood. He then ordered his men to lay down their weapons, not as defeated captives, but as soldiers who had completed their contract with history, announcing to his troops that they had surrendered honorably to General Patton. This reinforced the narrative that the Third Army was a sanctuary of military tradition in a world that was rapidly becoming unrecognizable. And the floodgates began to creak open as word spread that Patton was a man of his word. The most dramatic confrontation occurred on May 7, the incident involving the 800 men that had initially panicked the 11th Armored Division. But this time, Patton decided to shatter the protocol of the High Command and handle the matter with his own hands. He drove his jeep directly to the front lines, his presence announced by the gleaming stars on his helmet and the ivory grips of his revolvers. Walking straight into the heart of the German battalion as American soldiers watched with bated breath, fearing a sniper's bullet. The German battalion commander, a major who looked as though he were carved from iron, snapped to attention and delivered a salute that Patton returned with equal gravity, a moment of mutual recognition that bridged the divide between two warring nations. Patton stood before the 800 men, his eyes scanning their weary faces, acknowledging that they were surrendering not because they were broken in spirit, but because the war itself was a failed endeavor that no longer required their sacrifice. The German major spoke of honor and reputation, telling Patton that they trusted him to treat them correctly because he fought like a German officer, a compliment that Patton likely took with more pride than any medal bestowed by his own government. Patton assured the major that his men would be treated as prisoners of war, according to the Geneva Convention, and that the officers would retain their sidearms as a sign of respect for their service, giving his personal word as a general of the United States Army. This wasn't just a tactical win, it was a soul-deep victory for Patton, who saw himself as the guardian of a vanishing martial order. And as the German soldiers laid down their weapons simultaneously, the sound of 800 rifles hitting the ground echoed like a final salute to the old world. One German soldier was heard whispering to his American guard that they were lucky because they had found the one man who understood what it meant to be a soldier, a sentiment that was beginning to define the final hours of the Third Army's campaign. As May 7th bled into May 8th, the trickle of individual units became a torrential flood, as entire divisions began to pivot their retreat toward the Third Army lines, creating a logistical bottleneck that threatened to overwhelm Patton's processing centers. Thousands of men were appearing daily, asking the same obsessive question: is this Patton's army? And refusing to begin the surrender process until they were certain they were in the hands of the old blood and guts himself. One German sergeant explained to his interrogators that his unit had walked for 3 extra days, bypassing closer British units and enduring starvation, just to reach Patton's sector because they believed an honorable enemy was safer than a dishonorable ally. The geography of the surrender was being warped by Patton's personality, as the German army essentially voted with its feet, choosing to walk toward the man they feared most in battle because he was the only one they trusted in defeat. However, this Patton sanctuary had one very clear and very violent exception: the Waffen-SS, who knew all too well that the general's respect for the professional soldier did not extend to the ideological executioners of the Nazi regime. While the regular Wehrmacht sought out the Third Army, the SS units attempted to flee in the opposite direction or blend into the masses of regular prisoners, hoping to escape the scrutiny of Patton's intelligence officers, who were specifically trained to hunt them down. Patton's orders regarding the SS were cold and uncompromising, demanding that they be separated, documented, and prepared for war crimes trials, as he famously remarked that he wasn't fighting the German soldier, but the Nazi regime itself. He viewed the Wehrmacht as men doing a difficult job for their country, but he saw the SS and Gestapo as criminals who had forfeited their right to the honors of war, a distinction that only further incentivized the regular soldiers to find him before they were caught in the crossfire of the looming purges. This distinction was the key to Patton's success in ending the local resistance so quickly, as he realized that by offering a dignified surrender to the regular army, he was effectively decapitating the Nazi leadership's ability to call for a total war or a guerrilla insurgency in the Bavarian mountains. He understood that a soldier who feels respected is a soldier who will stop shooting And every German who walked 3 days to find the Third Army was a German who wasn't hiding in a basement with a Panzerfaust waiting for an American tank. By the time VE Day was officially declared on May 8th, Patton had become the accidental warden of the largest collection of willing prisoners in military history, all because he chose to see the enemy through the lens of his own warrior code, rather than the political hatred of the era. The consequence of this reputation was a smoother transition to peace in his sector than almost anywhere else in the crumbling Reich, proving that in the end, the most effective weapon in Patton's arsenal wasn't his tanks, but his name. By May 8, 1945, the Russian factor had become the primary engine driving thousands of soldiers toward Patton's lines, as rumors of the brutal conditions in Siberian labor camps and the high probability of immediate execution spread like wildfire through the retreating German divisions. For many, the choice was binary: certain death or enslavement in the East, or a slim hope for professional treatment in the West under a commander who shared their martial values. This created a frantic westward race, where German units abandoned their heavy equipment, pushed their vehicles to the breaking point, and marched until their boots fell apart, all to cross the invisible line into Patton's jurisdiction before the Red Army could close the trap. When they finally caught sight of the American olive drab and the distinctive Third Army insignia, many hardened veterans broke into tears of pure relief, knowing that while they were still prisoners, they were now safe from the vengeance of the Soviet Union. Inside the prisoner of war processing centers, a fascinating thematic phenomenon began to emerge: the preservation of military dignity in the face of total defeat. A senior Wehrmacht officer, a colonel who had survived the meat grinder of 2 world wars, was brought in for interrogation by American intelligence officers who were curious as to why he had specifically targeted the Third Army for his surrender. His answer stripped away the complexity of the war to reveal a simple, profound truth. Patton fought like a German would fight, with aggression, discipline, and honor. The colonel explained that when a nation has lost everything, its territory, its leaders, and its future, the only thing a soldier has left is his dignity. By surrendering to a worthy opponent like Patton, who acknowledged their service rather than treating them like common criminals, these men felt they were closing their chapter of the war with their heads held high. Patton himself was acutely aware of this dynamic and utilized it to his full advantage, often clashing with his own staff and superiors over the treatment of these masses of men. When a young American captain questioned why they were putting so much effort into making the enemy feel good about surrendering, Patton delivered a lecture on the cold reality of preservation of life. He argued that every German who chose to walk toward him and lay down his arms was a German who wasn't shooting an American boy in a last-ditch guerrilla effort or a suicidal defense of a nameless village. Respect, in Patton's view, was a strategic tool. It was the grease that made the machinery of surrender faster, effectively ending the war days earlier than if the Germans had been cornered and forced to fight to the bitter end. This philosophy extended to the formal surrender ceremonies that Patton insisted upon, even when military protocol deemed them unnecessary and a waste of time. On May 8th, he presided over a massive assembly of German officers representing thousands of prisoners, turning a bureaucratic necessity into a dignified historical event. Patton addressed the men through a translator, his voice booming as he acknowledged their bravery and assured them that they would be fed, sheltered, and treated according to the Geneva Convention. He spoke to them as one professional to another, famously stating, "We are soldiers, we understand duty and honor." When he returned the salute of the defeated German officers, it was an act that shocked his subordinates. But for Patton, it was a necessary recognition of the martial bond that transcended borders and ideologies. However, the logistics of being honorable were nearly impossible to maintain as the number of prisoners swelled to tens of thousands per day, stretching the Third Army's resources to the absolute limit. Supply officers pleaded with Patton to lower the standards of care, citing a lack of food and medical supplies. But the general remained unsympathetic, ordering them to figure it out, because he refused to starve men who had surrendered to him in good faith. He believed that the United States could afford to be generous in victory, and that the long-term consequences of this generosity would pay dividends in the rebuilding of Europe. This insistence on standards meant that Third Army camps, while crowded and austere, became known among the German population as the gold standard of captivity, further encouraging the peaceful transition of power in the occupied territories. The long-term impact of this Patton Protocol was perhaps best captured in a letter the general received in June 1945 from a former German colonel named Friedrich Müller. Müller wrote to thank Patton for the unexpected fairness and professional courtesy his men received, noting that they had expected cruelty but found respect. He stated that America, through Patton's leadership, had shown the defeated Germans that honor could still exist even after such a total and destructive conflict. Patton reportedly read this letter 3 times, keeping it in his personal papers until the day he died, perhaps seeing it as the ultimate validation of his belief that the warrior code was the only thing that could survive the fires of total war. As historians later analyzed the surrender patterns of the war's final weeks, the data supported the legend. A disproportionate number of German forces had indeed gone out of their way to reach the Third Army. Interviews with thousands of prisoners revealed consistent themes. The mention of Patton's honor and his understanding of the professional soldier appeared hundreds of times in official reports. The conclusion was inescapable. Patton had cultivated a brand of leadership that was so powerful it functioned as a magnet for the enemy, drawing them out of the fight and into the fold of the Western Allies. In the final analysis, the story of the Patton surrenders is not just a footnote of World War II, but a profound study in the cause and consequence of reputation. Because Patton fought with such ferocity, his mercy carried more weight. Because he demanded such high standards of his own men, the enemy trusted him to maintain those same standards for them. In those chaotic days of May 1945, the world saw a rare moment where mutual respect between mortal enemies actually saved lives and shaped the peace that followed. The legacy of these surrenders helped bridge the gap during the early days of the Cold War, as many of the officers who had surrendered to Patton eventually became key figures in the rebuilding of the West German military, carrying with them the memory of American fairness. Patton had realized what many politicians had not, that the war was a struggle against an ideology, but the peace would be built by the men who survived it. By treating the Wehrmacht as soldiers instead of monsters, he ensured that the end of the war was not just a cessation of hostilities, but the beginning of a stable, if uneasy, new order. If you were a German soldier in May 1945, would you have risked everything to find Patton's lines? Or would you have surrendered to the nearest Allied unit available? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.